What kind of a world do we want to live in? This podcast opens the difficult and uncomfortable conversations about crime, addiction, poverty, and more. If we want a healthier community, these messy conversations need to happen. This is Dangerous Ideas for Social Change. All right, welcome to Dangerous Ideas for Social Change. This is going to be a category of conversation that we will call random and that reckless, perhaps. And I mean, we are, again, in this never-ending search for dangerous ideas, actually dangerous ideas. And to date, we've only dabbled and we've got close, but who knows, maybe with these random conversations, we'll hit it and we'll get real dangerous. But with that in mind, with that goal ever present, I'm happy to sit here with Harvey Rempel. Harvey, why don't you just give a refresher what you kind of do? Harvey works with us here at Inner City Youth Alive. He's really a big believer in Elvis. I personally believe that Elvis is still alive. I don't know where you're at with that, Harvey.
I don't claim to know much about Elvis. I just found this T-shirt in a thrift store.
Fair enough.
And my mother-in-law loves Elvis, so I kind of got it for her. 3%
of Americans still believe he's alive, according to recent census data or whatever. Harvey, tell us what you do.
Yes, so I work as a community minister here with Inner City Youth Alive. I've been here for, I think, 19 years now. So we run a bunch of different programs. We have different drop-in nights for different ages, camps, different kids clubs, discipleship clubs, step up construction, engage education, all different kind of things. But there's a team of community ministers who kind of have flexibility intentionally built into our schedules to be able to kind of respond to needs and situations that might arise from day to day. Mostly it's building relationships, earning trust, and walking alongside friends and families in the neighborhood. Each one of us has kind of a little bit of a different niche. One of our team is walking with a lot of single moms. Another person is, kind of different like that. And my role, certainly in the first 10, 15 years, was largely working with a lot of young gang members and their families. And I'm still connecting with many of those same individuals, but a lot of them now are older. Some of them are incarcerated. Some of them are homeless, struggling with hardcore addictions. And so I've been learning much more about that world in these last years. And it's also meaning that the way I usually describe it is it's walking alongside people in the day-to-day challenges of life, of trying to get kids back into school if they've been kicked out, helping emergency family, like food situations, or helping families move. It means being there in the joys of life when there's a new baby that's been born or like a graduation. And it means being there in difficult times if somebody's been arrested, if somebody's been shot or stabbed, or if somebody's died. We've been doing lots of funerals in the last years. And
that's not fun.
No, that's been very difficult, very meaningful, because it's most often people that we have known for years and walked with. And sometimes we're just there, present, mourning, and just sitting with the family. Other times we're the ones leading the services and just trying to provide comfort and care for families during those times or whatever. So it's a mixture of. So basically it means you never know what you're going to be doing when you get to work in the morning. And one text or one knock at the door can change it all.
Yeah, that's good. Good to kind of have that background, because we want to talk about crime and we want to have a little bit more of a drawn-out conversation about some of the things happening in our community. And knowing that you kind of have an unfiltered lens, like you've seen things. You've dealt with, some of what's happening around crime with families impacted by crime. Could you give us a little bit of a picture of, I've had this sort of thing I've been saying of late, where 3 minutes or 3 lines of media text equals roughly 3 years of hard work in the community to help people to come to healing, and that's probably an understatement. But so often in today's sort of media environment, people might read the newspaper and see somebody was murdered, somebody died, and then they don't see any of what happens after that. It's just like a 24-hour news cycle over, but you kind of see the long term. So could you give us a little window into what a violent crime actually means in the neighborhood?
So there's a few things that come to mind. So I'm sometimes asked to do what we kind of call like a learning drive or whatever for maybe a group of students or some people, just to kind of learn a little bit about, what's happening in our neighborhood and some of the positive things and some of the challenges as well. And one of the things that I think sticks out to people is that there's different memorials, kind of street memorials, whether it's graffiti, rest in peace, or whether it's, some candles or teddy bears, posters taped to a tree or to a post or something like that. I think about how that impacts kids when they're walking to school every day, walking to the corner store or whatever. Every day you're passing by these reminders of violent death that have happened. How can that not impact you, at least somewhat? Especially because maybe the kids don't necessarily all have somebody that's processing it with them in a helpful way or, interpreting it. I think of friends who, have lost family members to violence. So even when they're adults, if this maybe happened when they were a kid, that still affects them. That still, those reverberations are still ongoing. Or a little kid. I mean, I remember this little boy that I met. I was visiting some friends and we were just hanging out on their porch, and their house was kind of just a hangout spot for that whole block kind of, and all of a sudden a little kid was there, a little 5-6-year-old guy, and he comes to me and we're just talking for a minute, and then he's like, I found my mommy hanged in the closet. And I was just, at first it took me a second to realize, and then I realized he was talking about he had found his mom who had committed suicide, and I got to know that family a little bit, and certainly some of the members in the family and stuff like that. But again, like that's a little kid who one has witnessed something horrific, has had, a traumatic loss or whatever, but how's that not gonna, even in the healthiest, most supportive and encouraging environment, that would carry with you. But
if I can just jump in, because I had an interesting conversation with the Kukum in the community who told me a story about her grandson. So her daughter had been murdered, and again, trying to put some shape to the headlines. Her daughter had been murdered. The 2-year-old had been on the scene where it happened and had been hungry, and eventually got out a door and went outside, and somebody found him. Okay, that's a horrible thing to take in, right? Even just to hear that story. Yeah. And I know the family, beautiful, amazing family, and so now this is their loss. But the Kukum brought this little boy, who's now an adult, or he's around 15 or 16, had been in our programs during the day, and his grandma brought a cake for us to say thank you. And then she said something to me that I didn't quite know how to process. She said, I won't use his name, but this little guy grew up his whole life thinking that his job, when he grew up, was to murder the man who killed his mom. And then, in a twist of, how things go, she said, but thank God that burden is off of him now, because that man who did that to my daughter died by suicide in prison. So it's like so many things rolling around there. Yeah. But to me, it was just a picture of that kid carried that burden. So, that was it was in the news. People will have read about it. but you just have no idea how many years that sort of stretches out.
And I think for people who have not grown up in the inner city here in Winnipeg, like Winnipeg is, they always say it's like a now I'm messing up the term. It's like a big city, but it's a kind of a small town vibe or whatever, right? It's not a huge city. Mm-hmm. It's not a little town. But the whole thing kind of where everybody knows each other, or that you're always going to run into someone that you know, much more so than maybe in a massive city. I don't know. What I'm trying to say is that everybody knows everybody, or at least lots of people know lots of people.
Right.
What I'm trying to get at is many of the people I know, they don't know just one person or two people that have been killed or have died through horrific violence. They know 15 or 17 or 20 people, whatever. It's not just one person that they were close to that died of an overdose. It might be 15 or 20 people that they've known. I was just with a guy a little while ago when we were talking about his years in elementary school. And his dad was locked up, and his mom had been struggling with addictions and was just so frustrated she had kicked him out when he was 10 years old, and he lived in a park for a while and eventually kind of started hanging out with older gang members and stuff like that. But he was talking about his class when he was in elementary school. I think it was a class for kids that were struggling, had been kicked out of lots of other ones, and he was just saying, like, this guy's dead, this guy's dead, this guy was killed, this guy was killed, this guy's in jail. And I think people are not only carrying their own trauma, but it's just we talk about stacked trauma, or just the, I don't know, it just is, it compounds. So often you hear people talking about, I haven't even had a chance to process my brother's death, or haven't even had a chance to process this death or that death or that death, and now another person has died.
Which is kind of what stacked trauma is about, is that you just don't get a chance to debrief it and you're on to the next.
Yeah. Sometimes I'll even be with somebody, and I was with them the week before when, something pretty awful happened, like whether, they got stabbed or somebody, tried to attack them or things like that. And I'm a week later asking them about it, and they barely remember it because so much has happened. And like sometimes what some of our friends experience in a week is what maybe an average person coming up in a more mainstream middle class environment has maybe the worst things they've experienced in their life. And it just is week after week after week that you can barely even remember. Like it just all blurs, and it just becomes numbing. And yeah, it just is ongoing.
I'm trying to think through, like, sometimes my wife will tell me that my the way we talk about some of these things are not normal, because we can talk about, some of the things you've experienced, and it seems like gratuitous. Like to a listener, it's like spotlighting, like Brene Brown talks about, it's too much. People can't even look at it, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm curious, like, how do we go from, and again, I guess we're picking up on the theme of the stuff that we see in the media. We see the data, and the data, of course, is it's tough. It's tough data. But until you see the story, you don't really get in behind the headline. And that's where I feel that now I have a few soapboxes, I suppose, but what I found so frustrating is that some of what's happening is it's a policy level issue, and we don't need to get into the policies, but in terms of bail reform, we've had 13 premiers write a letter to our now Liberal government and the previous Liberal government, imploring them to do some bail reform, and so, but nothing. I can remember kind of asked to give commentary during the election, because there was talk then about bail reform, and I predicted that it was just election rhetoric. It was just election time. So here we are, still no bail reform, and so to map onto what you were saying is that if you're distant, like if you don't have the personal details, you can tinker. Like if you don't realize how much what this violence means in a community, then you can sit in Ottawa in your air-conditioned office and tinker with it or get to it at a later point. And so the sense of urgency that is felt in a community racked with violence, and not say that that's all of it, absolutely not.
No, for sure not.
But where a lot of the violence is taking place, and I'll just throw this data down, that Winnipeg has a homicide rate of 4.4 per 100,000, and our neighborhood has a murder rate of 103 per 100,000. So it's quite a bit different. Tijuana, I believe, has a murder rate of 130 per 100,000, and I'm not remembering. There's another city, Tijuana, and Puerto Vallarta has also a murder rate in the high hundreds, but below the 130. So there's this concentration, and often it's connected to social situations like poverty, and again, not to say that people who are poor are violent. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there's this concentration of the problem sits here, and then I feel like a voice in the wilderness saying, change these policies. Like, will somebody please do something about bail reform?
I know one thing that makes me think of it. In the news here in Winnipeg in the last couple of months, there's been a few more high-profile stories about Health Science Center and some of the both crime there, like situations in the emergency rooms and just kind of on that campus or in that area, especially for people who are working at the hospital and nurses and stuff like that. And I think nurses unions have been very much speaking out against that, and there was different sexual assaults and different acts of violence there, and that's really messed up and awful and should not be like that. The people working there should have a safe place. But one of the things that I kept thinking every time I'm reading that, I'm like, hundreds and hundreds of families live within a block or two of HSC. I used to live a block from HSC on Furby. I know different families, single moms, different, like they're also all facing that violence, and whether it's sexual assaults or just violent acts or theft and so I just trying to recognize that many of those families might not have the same kind of voice that a nurses union would have, speaking to the public or speaking to the media, I guess, and stuff like that. But I just want to say, yes, the nurses, the people working at the hospital should have significant better safety standards or situations, but so should the people in that neighborhood, in other, in the communities surrounding that area. Like, I just read online all these people saying, oh, I would never come there or never kind of, and I'm like, oh, tons of kids live there, like tons of people that are just trying to raise their families, and that are just kind of, tons of good people live there that are also encountering a lot of these very real dangers and challenges.
It kind of points at again, we're talking about the power disparities, right? Like, where our federal government, who they lay out these federal laws that make bail, make individuals who commit violent crimes, they get released and released and released, and yet they hold the power, like they have the power to change that situation. Same thing with the nurses union. Again, we're not disparaging the nurses union. Obviously, they they're exercising the power they have. But I think that community members, it starts to become very discouraging when the people that are experiencing the violence don't actually have a say. And then in my darkest moments, I have, offered up that I think sometimes the poor are nothing more than lab rats in a giant social experiment. That's kind of dark, but I'm just trying to make the point that even in our talking about violent crime, and as a society, in talking about it, we talk about it to sort of the satisfaction of the theorists. Like so if you're on radio, then and you're discussing the issue of violence, that host is often trying to satisfy the interests of their listeners. And so the people, most impacted by it then are left out of the conversation. Like where the question should be, what does violence mean to those kids that live near the health science center? Like can we hear their voice? Like what does it mean for families in our community? And again, it's very hard if somebody's experienced violence. Well, obviously they're in the throes of grief and trying to process that. But what are their wishes? What do they want to have happen? And I don't know whether you have any insight on this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is controversial to say or not, but what's this podcast called?
Dangerous Ideas. Say something controversial. For heaven's sake, would somebody say something controversial?
I think the rate of violence is actually way higher than it's indicated, because the majority of people that I know who are victims of violence never report it, never talk about it, never, even getting stabbed, getting shot and stuff like that. They're not going to the hospitals for that. Obviously sometimes they are. And if it's, okay, sometimes we do get texts. I just got stabbed. Can you bring me to the hospital and stuff like that? But so much of what happens within the world of the people that are struggling with addictions, struggling with homelessness, and or at least like in the world of meth, in the world of down or fentanyl and stuff like that, there is tons of violence, and none of that is, I shouldn't say none of that, but the majority of that is never.
My skin is crawling. I'm just dying to ask the question.
Never adds.
Because we have to ask the question, why? Why? I think too, a while back, a young man was stabbed in the head with a screwdriver for the crime of standing at the bus stop. And he came over to our building, and I sat with him, and we talked it through. And there was no way, he wasn't reporting any of that. He was, it didn't penetrate the skull, so he just patched it up and went on his way. So why? Because this is always one of the things that you see in sort of, late stages of where crime just kind of goes crazy, is that you have policing, and you report to policing. If you get satisfactory sort of response, then the system is working. But once that starts to break down, then crime data gets messed up because it's just not reported. It's pretty common from what I understand, and so there's.
Even sorry, just to things like bicycle theft and stuff like that. Like I whatever numbers are out there are probably not even a tenth of what's actually taking place. And that's and maybe a little bit of an extreme example, but that's I think everybody in the city knows that the stats are not. And I think even the people putting that out would acknowledge that. I would think. So
people have kind of lost faith in anything coming of their reporting these things, so they stop reporting it.
Yeah, I would. I wonder if that's different in different parts of the city. I suspect it would be somewhat. I don't know quite how you can, document what's not being reported, at least in any scientific way or whatever. But certainly there's many things that happen in our neighborhood that people know about that are not being reported. I'm not saying that that's a good thing. And I don't know that, and there are certainly some things that do get reported and stuff like that, but it just is that, the whole no snitching thing and stuff like that, which is certainly kind of like a code of the streets thing.
Snitches get stitches, that kind of, yeah.
Yeah. And that is, I would, in my experience, it's not as strong maybe as in some inner cities in the US. It is a reality here, but still, I mean, the crazy thing is Winnipeg has one of the highest murder solve rates in Canada.
Yeah, their clearance rates are crazy.
Yeah. So that might be a different discussion, and I don't, I'd be curious to learn more about that and the reasons behind it. But people do talk. Eventually people do talk, and even do talk to police and stuff like that for stuff like that. But that code is still out there for sure, and many people are afraid to.
If you go down our street here to the corner of Powers and Aberdeen, that stop sign says "Stop Snitching."
Yeah.
It's like, so it kind of reinforces your thought. So,
yeah, I think, I'm not entirely sure where I'm going with this.
That's okay.
The world, sometimes when I visit or accompany friends of ours in the law courts and trying to navigate the labyrinth of the justice system and stuff like that, and we're sitting in court, and then I'll, there might be an intermission or before the judge gets in, and you'll hear the lawyers talking about, their latest trip or whatever, and they're just, talking among themselves, and even sometimes a little bit with the judge or with each other. And it hits me so, like, it's such a different world. And I'm not knocking that. I'm just recognizing that the reality of that world where they're in is just so different from the reality of the world of maybe that friend that I'm accompanying, or advocating for that morning is there for. And especially for our friends who do get pulled into that world of violence, of drugs, of gangs, of hustling, of addictions, it's so disconnected from it. It reminds me almost a little bit of COVID, like when COVID was first happening and stuff like that. It in certain parts of society, in many parts of society, it was a massive, huge thing, and like the biggest thing everybody's talking about, and everything's super, like stores were changing, everything was changing. In that world, it was barely a blip on the radar. I'd have to try and explain to people, this is really something happening. Like this is it just is so disconnected. So sometimes it feels like people say, well, if only we had stricter law or more stricter consequences or whatever, that would make a difference. I'm not saying that it wouldn't in the enacting of stuff of, a person not getting out on bail necessarily as easily or something like that. But I don't know how much of a difference it would make in a person's mindset when they're in the middle of an action, or when there's violence taking place, or when there's robberies or something like that.
It wouldn't be a deterrent knowing that, this is going to...
No. Or...
Why?
Part of the reason why is because, and again, this is...
controversial.
A dangerous idea. Because the person committing that violence has had violence committed against them 10 times. Mm-hmm. And if none of those ever resulted in anybody getting arrested or anybody doing any time or any of those kind of consequences that we usually think about in society as consequences for violence or for crime, that doesn't even... It just matters in who happens to get caught in whatever situation. It feels like sometimes, like I think about it with when my kids were little. If Johnny had been pulling his little sister's hair and stuff like that, and was misbehaving and stuff like that. Well, if I wait 2 weeks and then I come home and say, hey, Johnny, do you remember 2 weeks ago when you were pulling little Susie's hair or whatever? Like, that was not okay. Now you're going to have a timeout or something like that. Like, it's completely disconnected. The consequence is completely disconnected to the act or whatever, right? So
justice delayed is justice denied. It's that time frame, the connection to the crime kind of
justice delayed is justice denied. Yeah, and both for the victim and also for the perpetrator. Because often when I would visit youth in the youth center, some of them would be in there for 1.5 years before they're sentenced for what they're arrested for. It even happens. Sometimes they'd be in there for 1 year, and then all of a sudden they'd be like, oh, yeah, now we're not pursuing this anymore, so sorry for locking you up for 1 year, but you're free to go now.
Charges are dropped,
and and I'm like, oh my goodness, like if this was somebody from a different place in society, this would be a huge lawsuit. This would be in the newspapers, this would be wherever.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm trying to get at is, again, I don't know fully how to put words to this, but when I think of some of the friends that we've walked with that have been both perpetrators of violence and at times of significant and troubling violence, have also many times over been victims of that same kind of violence. So it seems like to them it often feels random. I can do 10 robberies. All of a sudden, this one robbery, there's video footage of it, or this one person spotted me, or this one matters. The other ones, there was no consequence, no anything for that, or whatever. Yeah, I think that just makes all of this so much murkier. For, like I'm thinking of a young man who just called me from jail this week. Just as an aside, he's been struggling with a fentanyl addiction these last months and has been kicked out of different places. So he's been kind of living in a little shelter that he built in kind of an industrial park area. And that's where I would go find him. He was so thankful that he just got arrested. He was almost, I don't want to say giddy, but he'd been through his withdrawals already. And he was like, basically he was saying, I'm so glad I got arrested because now I could finally get clean and hopefully I can get into treatment and hopefully I can, whatever, all this stuff. So that's...
You've often talked about jail as a circuit breaker. I've used that.
Yeah, for sure. And so just as an aside, but anyways, he was calling me. Well, this same guy, I when I first met him, his after school job was to go steal bikes. Like his auntie would pick him up after school, drive him with the pickup truck out to the suburbs, and they would just go steal bikes, fill up the pickup truck with bikes, and then come back to the neighborhood and just sell them for, $20 or $40 or whatever. That was his after school job. Or another girl that we knew, her after school job was to go water the plants in a grow op. And so when you're being told by the adults and by the role models in your life that this is how you provide for our family, this is how you, and then there's other people saying, well, this is wrong or this is bad. Like it
kind of a conflicting messages there.
Very, very much so. And then at times when they see people who are in more legit kind of roles doing the same kind of things, So, for example, and again, in the same way we're talking about nurses, we're not intending to be disparaging of any institution. But I would say most of the gang-involved youth and young people that I've walked with don't have respect for police as an institution, but they almost all have respect for individual police officers who they feel have been respectful. They know it's a police officer's job to arrest them if they're selling drugs or something like that, or if they're, carrying weapons but it's how it's done. If it's, there's ways that can be very dehumanizing. And so, yeah, a friend who he was involved in drug dealing. I mean, I'm not defending him in any way, but he had a certain amount of money that was saved up in his stash or whatever it was, And then when the place was raided and then the report was made, what was reported as the money found was, I think, 20% of the money that he had there. So he's like, well, where did 80% of that money go? And he's like, how is that any different than what I'm doing? It just is, certain people it's okay and certain people it's not. So again, not trying to disparage police in general. And we can only imagine, and I mean, we've had really some meaningful and very genuine encounters. But I also know, just like in every part of the world, whatever, there's people that can abuse their power at times or whatever, right? So these different kind of examples that, yeah, I don't know, for some reason that word murky is in my mind. That just makes everything so murky for some of our friends and neighbors in saying what is okay and what isn't, and when is it okay and when is it not, and when, like, it just
I think the thing that our listeners might sort of have a window into is that on a certain level, again, kind of starting with or ending with where we began, in a sense, talking about, you know, that media, the stuff that happens that we see in the media, that there's more to it. Things are not as they appear. You can read that article, but you're talking about the complexity of it all, of what happens after the crime, of what motivates the crime, of kind of when parts of what like, I mean, certainly this example of policing and that the missing money. I mean, it just says that we've got so much brokenness within the system, and what's sort of a takeaway that our listeners could imbibe or take in, so that when they look at the news and they see what's happening, what's something that they could kind of have as a little reminder about how to look at that? I don't know if that's a question. I'm hitting you cold, Harvey.
I don't know if this is quite an answer to that or not, but so yeah, there's the stereotypes of the different responses to crime, right? There's the hug a thug kind of thing, whatever, that's often kind of mocked, and then there's the just lock them up and throw away the key, and maybe hopefully there's a middle ground somewhere in between that. Two things. One thing that I often see mocked in not necessarily the media, but in in comments, like online, like newspaper article and then comments or things like that. Sadly, often when somebody has lost their life, when somebody's been killed, and then there's interviews with the family and people are talking about how this person was trying to change their life, this person was trying to, and I just see that mocked over and over again. And on one hand, I understand that where that's coming from. People are just tired of the crime and the violence and the whatever, and then they're like, oh, this person was involved in that life, that means they whatever. But the flip side is
they kind of had it coming.
Yeah, that would be what a lot of people might feel or think. Flip side is most people that I walk with that are in that life are at different times trying to change. Very few want to stay in that life. I get calls from jail from guys 18, 19, 20 that are calling me asking to go talk to their younger brother or their younger cousin. They don't want them to follow their footprints. They don't want, or their footsteps. They don't want them to join the gang. They don't want them to follow in that life, and asking if maybe I can kind of try and intervene. When guys are 15, 16, 17, maybe they're kind of all about repping this or that, whatever. But by the time they're 18, 19, 20, they've already experienced so much of the costs of that, of losing friends, of losing freedom, of, a lot of the loss. Now, it's hard for them to admit that in front of their bros or in a big, in public, whatever. But when they're one-on-one, alone in a little visiting room, crying and expressing their anger and frustration and hopelessness and stuff like that. So now we are trying to help people get into treatment. We often get calls or people like asking for help. Well, that is not that easy. You can't just go somewhere and say, here, I'm ready today, let's go in. It's a whole, and we've talked about that before, like that's a whole huge process. Or trying to get back into school, or trying to get, IDs, trying to get housing is probably almost the biggest for so many of our friends that are getting out of jail. Like, they've been in jail for whatever long, 2 years or 12 months or whatever it is, and are sober, have a different mindset, are determined, but have nowhere healthy to live, and then are back in a trap house or back with family that is using or that is involved in that scene, and get pulled back into that life so quickly. What I'm trying to say is that many of our friends, even if it's not 100% of the time, but consistently and regularly are wanting ways out, and find those paths so difficult and so littered with obstacles and so challenging that they continue to fall back into ways of life that they're not wanting. When they are healthy and when they are sober and when they are safe, it's not the choices that they want to make. But when those choices feel limited and feel that they're up against the wall, many end up taking those. So what I'm trying to say is that I understand to a certain extent that mocking sentiment, but part of me inside is like, there's probably truth to it, that person was wanting to change, that person was wanting something different, that person did want a different kind of future for their kids or their younger brothers or cousins. The other thing I was going to say is that so oftentimes when things happen to people that I know, like if a friend of mine gets shot or gets stabbed or gets jumped or even killed, it has happened at times where we've known both the victim and the person the offender, or it's happened where one of our team was in a close relationship with the person who is the victim, and another member of our team is close to the person who is charged with the offense and stuff like that. At times, we've even had opportunities for reconciliation. At other times, if a life is lost or whatever, obviously that's not the case. I find it often, I still have compassion for our friends, even especially when they're victimized, especially when they're whatever, and the other person is somebody that I don't know. I maybe just know their name or their reputation or something like that. But deep down inside of me, I know that if I knew that person and knew their story and knew their mom, or had sat with them when their baby was born, or had been with them at their funeral for their younger sister who died, I would also be feeling for that person on a different level as well. And none of this is to justify any acts of violence.
No.
And none of this is to defend that or say that that's okay. Just to say that the more we hear each other's stories and the more we share our lives with each other, the more you understand. Well, the more you understand and the less you understand in some ways too, whatever. But you just see it differently. You experience it differently. And so you were saying kind of I don't forget the word you use, like a snippet of out of all of this or whatever. I think the same kid who is running in a diaper as a 2-year-old down the street and is, found wandering away from home.
That your heart is broken for.
That your heart is broken for. That same kid is that kid that at 14, is stealing cars or is, bear macing somebody on the bus or whatever, and maybe even is the same young man who, in a drug-fueled rage at 21 or whatever, has taken someone's life. And it still has the value of that little kid. Now, obviously, that victim also still has that value. We're not trying to undermine that at all, but to say that everyone in that story has that value.
It's kind of, I see kind of like an invitation to empathy, like inviting people to think about that the story is much bigger than what we read in the media. It's much deeper. And I think I've been just recently thinking about the fact, you've talked about different approaches to what to do about crime, kind of like the tough on crime, and I know, and you've described that crime is very tough on the one who commits it as well. And again, this is not me being an apologist for people who commit crime. I'm just saying that when people, 1% of society is actually sociopaths who would feel no remorse. But people who have been caught up in the violence, when they find their way home, to their best kind of life, there's always this regret for the things they've done. And there's always this deep that. It's horrible to have to carry the memory of the things you've done in those desperate places you found yourself. I've a number of things that come to mind of individuals who have said, I can't believe what I did when I was caught up in that. And so that's, I guess, our invitation to see past the headlines, see a little deeper into the stories of the individuals that are caught up in violence, and obviously with hearts full of compassion for victims as well. Harvey, thank you very much for this complex conversation and for taking it into honest places, and also thank you on behalf of our community for the work you do here in Winnipeg's North End.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Dangerous Ideas for Social Change.